Hi everyone, I'm Beatrice Gallelli, China Fellow at the Istituto for Internazionali, IAI, and Assistant Professor at Ca' Foscari University. At IAI, I'm part of the Global Actor Program, and today I'm extremely happy and glad to have with me Una Bērziņa-Čerenkova. Please accept my apologies for the bad pronunciation of your name. Okay, that's cool. And we will talk about China-Russia relations, and especially, of course, in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So thank you, Una, for being here with us today. Una is a political scientist and a China scholar, and she's the head of political science PhD program and the China Studies Center at the Riga Stradins University, head of the Asia program at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, a member of CERN and the European Think Tank Network on China, and she is the author of many articles and chapters also and analysis, and I warmly suggest you to read her latest book, Perfect Imbalance, China and Russia. This discussion with Una is actually the first of 4 interviews with the leading experts and leading scholars in the field of Chinese studies and Chinese history, China's political discourse, political communication, and the public diplomacy. The interviews are part of a 1-year project called Countering China's Disinformation in Italy. And with the aim and the specific aim of this project is to shed light on the contents basically of China's official discourse on a number of key and crucial issues, including, of course, the China-Russia relations. And we will start from this very pressing topic and hot topic at the moment in international discussion. And I will go very straight to the point, because since the very beginning of Russian invasion of Ukraine, Chinese leadership has somehow backed Putin's official position that what is going on is not a war, it is instead called a special military operation, and the root cause of the war should be blamed on the US and on the NATO. So at the same time, somehow ambiguously, Chinese leadership have also said that they support the principle of national sovereignty and territorial integration, and it also works for Ukraine. So the very first question I'd like to ask to Una is why has China adopted such an ambiguous position, basically? And what's behind it? Sorry.
Thank you, dear Beatrice, and it's an honor and a great pleasure to be here in a conversation with you today. I would also like to add that as a fellow discourse analyst and a China scholar and a specialist on keywords, also a person who likes to dig into the political discourse and the language and the manifestations of it, I think this is a wonderful exercise in analysis today. So it's a pleasure to be here. So indeed, how do we even gauge the Chinese position? You outlined it perfectly. On one hand, discursive approach to most, not all Russia's stories. Some outlandish stories such as the US biolabs in Ukraine, China also parroted in some of its discourse. But when it came to, for example, the story about Ukraine being overrun by Nazis or the Kiev regime being a Nazi regime, China did not pick up on that story and did not amplify it. Now, when I say China, who do I mean? Of course, we look at several layers of outputs, how we can analyze Chinese political discourse, and basically just to gauge and to get an understanding of what are the Chinese political elites thinking and what do they want to transmit and broadcast both domestically and abroad. And these levels are, first of all, of course, the top leadership that we religiously follow, these speeches, these press releases, these joint statements, these party reports, and those are, of course, the main foreign policy communicators of the People's Republic of China, with Xi Jinping at the top. Now, the second tier would be China's foreign policy officials who do not yield particular power, but whose job it is to kind of to put it out there, to put these keywords, these narratives, these versions out there. And of course, that is the foreign policy apparatus, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Councillor Wang Yi, who's been, many Kremlinologists, right? Of course, quote unquote Kremlinologists in the sense of Beijing, right? That in fact, he does not yield significant political power, but he is the mouthpiece of Xi Jinping's concepts. And he's been doing that very vividly. So there's a lot of text that we can follow. And of course, then there's the cascade of foreign policy communicators. Some of them are more wolf warrior-y, like Dao Lijian, as we know. Others are spokespeople of the Chinese MFA. Some of them have changed, some of them have remained. And others who are, and of course, also the diplomatic missions. So we have some ambassadors in Europe who have been louder, some of us who have been more diplomatic, but this is something that we follow as the second tier of Chinese political discourse on foreign policy. Now, as to the third tier, of course, that's the media. So that is the state-affiliated Chinese official media. We have the Xinhua News Agency, we have the People's Daily, we have China Daily in English, and all these outlets that, and then of course, other affiliated, but kind of the fact that something is out there, then we assume, okay, this is not reason for censorship, right? So if it's out there, also that. So these three levels are where we look, and then we look how these stories trickle down. And of course, Global Times as well. Now that is very quoted in the Western media because it's published in English. These and it's very, very vocal. And this within these three tiers of Chinese foreign policy discourse, we see a trend that the top tier is more composed, drier, sometimes cryptic. Second tier is, I'm talking about the MFA officials, is more kind of, can be more aggressive. So we have the 3 A's, right? Active, assertive, aggressive. They can be more active, assertive, and aggressive. And then the media tier can go all the way. For example, we all remember how the Global Times editorial called Lithuania a small, crazy country, right? That is something that is not diplomatic, but at the same time, it's a part of the official discourse that can be, that is being kind of put through this third tier. And now let me bring back this detour. Let me finish this detour by bringing back to your question. The existence of 3 tiers like that allows for something that China can, of course, we can call it ambiguity, but some authors call it contradiction. So when we look at the Chinese approach vis-a-vis Russian invasion in Ukraine, ambiguity it is not, contradiction it is, and it is something, and also something that I prefer to call a home before dark approach. They do venture into the Russian view of things. So China is more supportive than not of the Russian story because it serves their purpose of, like you said, painting the NATO expansion as the root cause of conflict and instability, and saying that it is ultimately the US agenda, the hegemon, that does this, and the countries are, quote unquote, pressed to the wall, right? So have to react somehow. So in the meantime, so that kind of feels like not ambiguous. That's quite sort of supportive of the Russian origin story, so to speak, of the war. But then China is careful not to be locked in fully into the Russian worldview because it does not want to, quote unquote, go down with a ship So as Russia is doing things that are in behind closed doors, probably in China, seen as being too much. And I think the civilian slaughter is one of these things that we know caused some commotion in China with you will have excellent speakers on that. You will have Marina Rudyak and Maria Repnikova, and I think it was Marina Rudyak who specifically outlined the connection of tweets remembering the Nanjing massacre just around the time when information out of Bucha came out. So the civilian massacres is something that is an issue. China's own human rights issues aside domestically, right? But here it's kind of, it touches a nerve. And also the fact that Russia is quite simply losing. So that kind of precludes China from from showing that this is kind of a total mutual venture. So, and in fact, at the end of the day, there is a big debate. There are two opposite arguments here. So some colleagues say that this still qualifies as support because China does not vote against Russia in the UN, whereas other colleagues tend to say that where it counts, China has not got Russia's back. So this is just talk, and it's only talk, it's self-serving, it's only as long as it serves China's agenda of blaming the West. So that is, I think we will talk more today also about what has China really done in terms of support, and hasn't done in terms of supporting Russia. But we should definitely also remember that the Ukrainian side is trying to play a bad hand very masterfully and has caught on this contradiction in Chinese foreign policy messaging, where on one hand you're saying we support sovereignty of countries, right, and territorial integrity. And on the other hand, you're saying the Ukraine situation is a specific historical circumstance, right? So they've caught it, and what their messaging has been interesting. We've seen it from the Minister of Foreign Affairs Kuleba, and we've also seen it in some video speeches by President Zelensky, where they say this Chinese position is, of course, not ideal, but it's still better than China's outward support vis-a-vis Russia. Let me find the quote. So, for example, let me quote Volodymyr Zelensky for one of his lectures. So he says, as for now, China is balancing and indeed has neutrality. And I will be honest, their neutrality is better than China joining Russia. It's important for us that China wouldn't help Russia. And this was August 2022, addressed to Australian students. So this is not first days of the war. This is already pretty deep into the war. Now, that leads us to think that, interestingly enough, this Chinese policy of, Zelensky calls it balancing, we sometimes call it ambiguity, Tim Ruley calls it contradiction, and quite frankly, so, and we also can call it home before dark, because China always makes a point of coming back before night falls, not to be locked into the Russian worldview. It could, in fact, work out for China at the end of the day.
Thank you. That was great. A very detailed picture of what's the narrative provided by Chinese leadership, and also the different layers of this of the China leadership, so to speak. And another issue with on which basically China's official narrative has actually baked the one of Russia is that economic sanctions doesn't work. They don't work at all. They are ineffective, and they are not deemed as a diplomatic tool to reach the goal of ending the war. Basically, they since the very beginning, China's spokesperson said, like, we are doing our best in our own way. As far as I remember, they use this saying, like, we are doing our best in our own way to end this war. And so somehow we have at the level of rhetoric and the narrative, China, as you said, is more supporting than not Russian official position. But on the ground, what's going on the ground? Is China economically supporting Russia, like for instance by buying Russian gas in a moment when Europe is trying to reduce at least the gas imported from Russia? Is China military supporting Russian military effort or not? Thank you.
This is an excellent question, and that has been my point all along, also in the book that you, thank you, that you referred to in my book on Russia-China, is that the discourse realm is disconnected or is not as connected with the reality realm, in fact, with the social practice. So the discursive practice using the model of Fairclough is disconnected in a lot of ways from the social practice. But to answer your question, I had to enlist some help as well, because this is a whole separate field of research, right? Monitoring what has been going on. And I need to refer to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, usec.gov. They have actually come up with a database, and let me quote a little bit from that database. They have created China's position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they're tracking key events and statements from the beginning, actually even before the war. And so far it's end of September, but I think they will that we will also have more information. And they actually have a very interesting methodology. They have organized these elements into 4 categories. They have action, sanction, statement, and media, right? So media, that would be pretty, so where statement and media is something that we basically just discussed, the political discourse. Whereas the sanctions is what we're very much interested in. And I would have to say, out of these, there are several that we have heard reports on that do sound already like support, right? So we already know that the China National Petroleum Corporation is going to pay for gas from Gazprom, from the Russian Gazprom, using renminbi. And the other half they will pay in rubles. So that kind of helps Russia with the value of the ruble. And that helps to reduce using euros and dollars. So that is kind of support. Another thing that we've seen is that the exports are I believe now it's the value is 6.7. Sorry, in the summer it was around 7 billion monthly, and that hasn't really shifted. So they haven't really pulled back on this. And of course, the Chinese higher value added goods are conveniently helping to fill this void that came about during because of the sanctions. And we're talking automotive, we're talking tech. Now, the big question is, oh, and of course, the ruble and renminbi trade also plays into this, right? So they're trying to do this with their own currencies. Now, another thing that happened is that Rusal, the aluminum company, aluminum producer, also started issuing renminbi denominated bonds in Russia, which is quite a big deal. Now, the question is whether these imports and these actions are double use, whether they also spill into the military. Because of course we also know about gas, and that kind of thing doesn't surprise us that Russia has replaced Saudi Arabia as China's largest crude oil supplier in the summer as well. But then the question, what about the war stuff? And we've seen the reports by the Wall Street Journal, for example, that China's exports of microchips, other electronic components, and raw materials to Russia have doubled in the first half of 2022. And of course, we understand that they are double use. Now, has that in any way then affected Chinese companies? And to me, and this is when we approach, in my opinion, the most important event, or the most important kind of point in this. We have all heard about this entity list of the U.S. Department of Commerce, right, where Chinese companies are added for example, facilitating the Uyghur detainment and what some experts go as to call a Uyghur genocide in Xinjiang. And so now, have any new companies been added? Then we could ask, looking over if those companies would support Russia, for example. And yes, we do see that in the summer, there are 5 Chinese companies that have been added to this entity list specifically over their support of Russia's military since Russia's invasion. And so what were these companies then doing? It's hard for me to judge because I'm not a military analyst, sure. But at the same time, it would seem that they provide something that the Department of Commerce stated is that the threshold for companies would be to provide support for the companies that they provide support to the Russian and Belarusian security services, militaries, and defense industrial bases. So it's quite narrow. Then we can make a conclusion that, in fact, at least on a limited scale, at least on a dual use scale, something might be going on. Of course, but then I would like to also go back to your initial premise of China being very skeptical of sanctions and being a critic of sanctions as an instrument of coercion. Let us not forget that China jumped on its own unproclaimed sanctions policy towards Lithuania, in fact, in 2021, right? So on one hand, then, we see that there is this narrative that sanctions are this Western pressure instrument that is unfair and that is, in fact, doesn't really, it's not really efficient too, but it is bad for the global economy, for stability, right? We see that Chinese foreign policy communicators, why are sanctions bad then? Because they destabilize the global supply chains, they rob our world, which is already in crisis, right? After COVID and after many blockages, we're already kind of hanging by a thread. I'm paraphrasing here, right? So we're hanging by a thread, and then you go ahead and introduce these sanctions, and then that kind of hammers the system even more. Well, with Lithuania, in fact, China's reaction, but of course, I mean, it is a red line for them. We understand Taiwan is a red line for China, but the actions were very much economic sanctions based, both proclaimed sanctions, such as not importing certain goods, and also under the table approaches that, like, removing Lithuanian producers from Chinese customs registry, effectively blocking any opportunity for them to enter Chinese soil. These kinds of under the belt sanctions, we could say, show that on one hand, there's critique of these methods, but on the other hand, there's no reluctance to use them in China's interest.
Yeah, sure. For those who are not familiar what's still going on between Lithuania and China, basically it is linked with Taiwan, and it may sound like ironical because it is a matter of how you call an office. Like, instead of calling basically the office of Taipei, so the representative of Taipei in Vilnius, they decided to call it the office
Taiwanese.
of Taiwanese,
which of course is Taiwan in the end of the day.
Of course,
Chinese.
Sure. And that this this change in the name basically made Chinese leadership very angry. And all the stuff that Una explained followed basically. Let's going back to the Russian-China relations, because when it comes, of course, to the military issue and to China's official position also on this, we can't not talk about this kind of security mechanism that Chinese leadership has actually put forward. Since the very beginning, as far as I remember, in February, Chinese leadership started talking about a European security mechanism, a concept which sounds quite close to the one pointed out by Russia a few years ago, if I remember correctly. And recently at the summit of BRICS countries, it was developed into a global security mechanism. So what's the meaning of this concept? Is it an alternative to the NATO? Is it going to evolve into a military alliance in your view, or is it just another way of blaming the NATO and this kind of what is called officially as a Cold War mentality?
Yes, the Global Security Initiative is if the word ambiguous comes, comes handy, then this is where we can use it. It's quite unclear, and Xi Jinping has spoken about, and then we had Wang Yi, of course, publish explainers on the Global Security Initiative, tying this initiative to the Global Development Initiative. Also, that kind of becomes hand in hand. I think China is being, from a narrative perspective, is being careful not to overemphasize the security bit here and to kind of link it with development, right? So the two, but so is the one of my colleagues asked informally as we were discussing after a conference, well, do you think the Global Security Initiative is China's new Belt and Road with guns? And it is a provocative question, and I don't think so, actually. So this also to circle back to your question about what is this going to be a Beijing-led NATO, bizarro NATO, so kind of counter NATO? I don't see it quite like that, for the practical reason that I don't see a lot of countries locking themselves into a military alliance with China. We do know that the only country that has a military alliance with China is North Korea, effectively. So we in ASEAN, yes, we don't see a lot of support vis-a-vis the Western agenda, the Western and the American specifically hawkish agenda vis-a-vis China. Of course, yes, we see that in ASEAN and also in Northeast Asia and in East Asia in general. There's kind of a more okay, we know how to work with the Chinese kind of approach. Yes, we're threatened, but we're not going to, form blocks. But that does not mean that these countries would jump on the opportunity to join a China-led military alliance. So I think that this global, but again, this is my tunnel vision as a Russia-China analyst. So I'm going to give you a theory, take it or leave it. It's up to you whether this makes sense or not. But like I said, this comes from me looking at this from a Russia-China perspective. I think that, in fact, due to Russia's not just failures in Ukraine, but also Russia's behavior in general, which is brazen, I think, for Chinese foreign policy as well. And maybe had the Russians quickly dominated Ukraine, a nightmare scenario for us, which would have been, I remind our listeners that I'm from the Baltic region, so that's pretty close. But then, had that happened, maybe we would have seen a different reaction from China. We don't know. But currently, we see that kind of being associated with Russia as a military allied partner is not ideal for China. And we will be touching upon the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and I will be tying that example into this story as well. So instead of coming up with a Russia-China alliance and saying that we are in an alliance with Russia, China is coming up, and Xi Jinping specifically is coming up with a wider network, which he has done before with Belt and Road, a non-specified, kind of without, not walled concept, which can be anything. And I think, and he ties it then immediately with multilateralism. Sure. So I think this is some kind of a trick of distancing from Russia, but not leaving Russia out. So Russia can, of course, because this global security initiative has also been discussed when Chinese officials speak to their Russian counterparts. So this is kind of, okay, if you want to come on board, but this is not about you. That's my theory. We'll see. Time will show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I have one last question, which is indeed on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because at the recent summit, I mean, the analysis of the outcome of this summit was quite, how to say, polarized, I would say, because on the one hand, there were some analysts saying, okay, this is a proof that Xi Jinping wants to help Russia through this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like making a tighter alliance with the countries involved. But on the other hand, some other analysts read what is the outcome of the summit as completely opposite, like saying, given that Xi Jinping went, before joining the other leaders in Samarkand, he went to Kazakhstan, which was kind of course, Kazakhstan was kind of afraid of Russian military operation aggression to Ukraine, and so by first going to Kazakhstan, it was kind of a message to Putin to say, this is okay, you are doing what you are doing in Ukraine, but you can't do it against other countries. So somehow it was a kind of trying to push Putin not to going beyond a specific limit. So what do you see? What's the outcome of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization? And again, maybe work as an opposite, as a military alliance against the NATO, given also that Iran has joined recently. And so what do you see in this? And also in terms of the development of China-Russia relations in the future after this summit? Thank you.
Yes, indeed. There are very contradictory readings of this. And I think that is something that we can chalk up to China's success in this so sometimes this contradictory balancing pays off. At the end of the day, China is careful not to go too deep into one or another side, but at the same time, it doesn't give any reason for Russia to be offended, right? So in my reading, and my reading comes from examining the Russian and the Chinese messaging on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. The Russian messaging very heavily featured the story, the narrative of this being a Putin-Xi bilateral meeting against the backdrop of, Central Asia and the old Silk Road and whatnot, which is a very, well, some colleagues call it a post-colonial Russian approach. There is that. There is a lot of superiority in the Russian culture when it comes to Central Asia. Sometimes they say it's connected to the fact that a lot of immigrant labor comes from Central Asia. But in fact, it's deeper than that. It's a lot of kind of cultural superiority in general. We all actually even saw some Russian the people who disagreed with Putin's war, some of them posted, "I have to run away, be it even to Kazakhstan." So basically, and then Kazakhs would say, you know what do you mean, even if it's Kazakhstan, right? We're a normal country. So it's a bit of that approach. And so in this Russian messaging, we saw that this is not about Central Asia. This is about Putin meeting Xi Jinping. And so the Russians came out, and Putin came out with this saying that there will be this bilateral meeting. The Chinese side's framing of the event was completely different. And you know it, right? Because we are colleagues and we share an interest in Chinese political official discourse. And what we saw was, this is about Xi Jinping this is about multilateralism. This is about China, reestablishing links with its region, with its closest region, Central Asia, which is extremely strategic for China after COVID. First visit in person for Xi Jinping outside of China after COVID, which is not technically over in China still, but and then the summit, and of course the first meeting is not Putin. The first meeting is, just like you outlined, is Tokayev in the capital of Kazakhstan, in Nur-Sultan, right? So meeting Tokayev as the primary partner, as the neighboring country, and then only going to Samarkand for the summit. Oh, and by the way, Putin's going to be there, so will Modi, so will Narendra Modi. Maybe we'll meet with Narendra Modi, who knows? And that was immediately a different story. And that shows us that these guys are not particularly on the same page when it comes to the China-Russia dynamic within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. More so, China actually turned the tables around on Russia. Russia is known for using India to balance China, using India, referring to its special relationship with India, historic relationship, kind of using India as this offsetter, saying, we have India, by the way, right? Now, China is bigger, it's stronger, it's got all this leverage, but for us, it's China and India, kind of a post-Primakov doctrine. And China did the same by saying, okay, we're going to meet with Putin and possibly Modi as well, bilateral. So on a meeting. I think it's very curious. Furthermore, but of course, the Putin-Xi meeting was wonderful. There were many compliments, much support, and all the rhetoric that we saw before, even before the war, right? It was consistent with that. This friendship, worldview support, all of that, yes, but it's the context that matters. And then one more, you know how it is with us researchers. Sometimes, I think it was Isaiah Berlin who said that the scientists are more interested in something being, in the result of their inquest being interesting rather than it being the truth. And maybe we're all guilty of this, and it's really hard to find the truth. But I think it is pretty interesting that Kazakhstan is actually taking a strong stand against, and we can really say against, the Russian military invasion in Ukraine. Kazakhstan welcomed people who are fleeing conscription from Russia. And Kazakhstan, just, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, when there was a, when the Russian ambassador in Kazakhstan was invited for a harsh conversation to the Kazakhstani MFA because they had requested that Kazakhstan banish the Ukrainian ambassador. Not only Kazakhstan did not, of course, banish the Ukrainian ambassador, but they called the Russian ambassador for a quote unquote chat. So that kind of shows that somehow they feel empowered to take a stand against Russia. And in a sense, perhaps China's conversation with Xi Jinping's conversation with Tokayev, as well as the joint statement, and basically the promise of sovereignty that was in this joint statement, right, that China supports. Again, it's the same, it's the usual words, but it's the context. Kind of shows that Kazakhstan is not an ally and an undisputable supporter of Russia's policies. And I think China's found a way to maybe not drive a wedge here, but to help the wedge a little bit. Yeah. So to me, I stand by the theory that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the future is going to be more and more China-led, with a stronger China role. It has a China role because it says so in the name. It's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, not St. Petersburg Cooperation Organization. I think that Central Asia will be kind of trying to, I don't want to say as loud as to drift away from Russia, but will definitely try to distance and maybe explore, especially Kazakhstan, right? We have, of course, other countries that are more dependent perhaps, but Kazakhstan is quite telling. So kind of not being, so if Russia is used to looking at the Central Asian Five as its own backyard, well, I think they're going to be faced with a very new reality, which will also be due to China's policy, but mostly because of their war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Una. You gave us a very, very detailed and deep analysis of what's going on, what's the China's position at different layers, and it was fantastic. Thank you very much. You mentioned that Kazakhstan, given that we mentioned Kazakhstan, I'd like to take the chance to say that to remind the people who are listening to us that this is the first discussion of a series made of 4 interviews with leading experts and on key specific topics, and one of the topics will be the Belt and Road Initiative. And you also mentioned Marina Rudiak, and we will talk with her about the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, which was launched in Kazakhstan in 2013. And all these interviews are available on the website of the IAI, so at www.iai.it. And once again, thank you very much, Una, for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. It was